My name is Ben Hartley. I'm from the Energy Efficiency and Cooling team here at SEforALL, and I'll MC today. Just want to thank you all very much for joining. We hope that you're safe and doing well wherever you might be in the world, and we greatly appreciate your taking the time to join us today. Today, Sustainable Energy for All and the Climate Policy Initiative will be presenting a framework for tracking cooling investment. Cooling had previously been labeled a blind spot for energy systems, but enabling access to sustainable cooling as a critical energy service is also, of course, the basis of achieving many of the SDGs. And as a result, more institutions are looking at ways they can finance sustainable solutions. At SEforALL, we've been focused on supporting governments, institutions, and other partners with new knowledge and tools to support that effort. In the spirit of what gets measured gets managed, this work is a product of our Energizing Finance series that tracks energy access finance with the intent of moving the ball forward on similar tracking effort for cooling. More on that in a moment, but I'll briefly run through the agenda. So first, you'll hear from Olivia Coldry, who leads SEforALL's energy finance work, followed by Cooper Weatherby of the Climate Policy Initiative, who will present the findings of the knowledge brief. After that, you'll hear from three experts from different institutions for their reactions. Shilpa Patel of the philanthropic Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, Giorgio Gualberti of the OECD, and Darren Bedrosian of the World Bank Energy Sector Management Assistance Program. We'll then hopefully have time for a brief Q&A. If you have questions in the meantime, however, please feel free to plug them into the chat. And if there is time to answer them in the chat, either the team at SEforALL, CPI, or panelists can try to do that in the meantime. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Olivia, who's the head of energy finance at SEforALL. Olivia, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ben. Good morning, everyone from Melbourne. It's great to have you with us today, and please let me add my welcome to the webinar. I'm sure you'll find it of huge interest. As Ben mentioned, I head up the energy finance work at SEforALL, and it's been a great collaboration with our cooling team to produce this knowledge brief, as well, of course, as with our long-standing partners, CPI, who you'll hear from via Cooper shortly. Let me just set some scenes for today's discussion. As we know well on this call, global cooling needs are already substantial, and we can expect them to continue to grow rapidly over coming years. As global temperatures rise, it's become clear that a dramatic expansion of cooling appliances and the energy demand associated with them can have serious environmental consequences, and a lack of access to cooling poses a significant challenge for both social and economic development. This increasing demand is going to require large volumes of finance, as we well know, for sustainable cooling solutions, both to minimise climate impacts and achieve the SDGs. So my colleagues in our Cooling for All team have a mission to generate the evidence, partnerships, policy and business solutions necessary to provide sustainable cooling for all and to reduce the energy demand needed to achieve this. According to the Chilling Prospects report that my colleagues produce, over 1 billion people among the rural and urban poor remain at high risk from lack of access to clean and efficient cooling. A further 2.2 billion lower middle income people lack access. In Africa alone, the rural poor population is growing and grew to 204 million in 2020, whereas in Asia, in the same period, the number of urban poor at high risk of lack of access to cooling solutions numbered about 484 million people. So this is a very significant issue that hasn't had the airtime as other aspects of energy access. To those of you who are new to the Energizing Finance Research Series, let me briefly introduce that and set the context for today. This is an initiative led by SEforALL as the first and only systematic analysis of finance commitments, disbursements and needs in countries with the largest energy access gaps. So we call these high impact countries. What we do through peer-reviewed methodologies and findings is identify financing trends, gaps and innovations that will inform achievement of SDG 7, that is global access to sustainable energy for everyone. So we're now in our 5th year of the Energizing Finance work, and I'm pleased that it's considered a trusted platform for marshalling evidence and benchmarking progress. We're very pleased to have collaborated closely with our colleagues at CPI to produce this research since 2017. One of our panelists today, Giorgio Gualberti of the OECD, can discuss how Energizing Finance's findings have informed the OECD's work in defining the codes used to track finance for energy access projects globally. And also Smap, represented here today by Darren Bedrosian, is a key contributor to Energizing Finance through providing critical data to inform the research and through its role on the steering committee. So one report under the Energizing Finance research is called Understanding the Landscape, and we've produced that report annually with CPI since 2017. That report tracks year-on-year finance commitments for energy access in 20 countries with the highest access deficits, as reported to us by the Tracking SDG 7, the Energy Progress Report. So Understanding the Landscape's analysis supports assessment of the effectiveness of policies and regulations in catalysing finance flows to what we call these high-impact countries. In producing that report with CPI, we follow a three-step approach. This includes, first of all, tracking finance for those sectors with a focus on commitments, electricity and clean cooking. Secondly, estimating the portion of finance committed for residential access in each of the sectors as distinct from commercial and industrial use. And thirdly, applying Smap's multi-tier framework to identify the type of access provided. So by any measure, and those of you familiar with the research will know this, our findings year on year remain stark. Achieving SDG 7 is going to require a massive deployment of financial resources, as we know. The IEA tells us that about $40 billion a year is going to be required for universal electricity access, and $5 billion a year to 2030 for universal clean cooking access to get us to SDG 7 in time. So what we see through our Energizing Finance work is that these figures are orders of magnitude higher than the finance we actually see being committed to sustainable energy projects in the countries we track year on year. So at this rate, we won't deliver universal energy access by 2030, and we really need a step change from our business as usual approach to get there. So turning more squarely to access to cooling, as temperatures warm, it's clear that this isn't a luxury. Like clean cooking, cooling is an energy service that's essential to SDG 7. Yet we don't know nearly as much about investment in cooling as we do about electrification and to a lesser extent, clean cooking. Energy efficiency was initially explored in 2018 for the first time as part of our Energizing Finance series, but it's always been our intention to take a deeper dive into the sector. Similarly, SEforALL's Chilling Prospects work points to the need for a tracking exercise for finance commitments for cooling solutions as an essential tool to evaluate how investment patterns compare to needs. So as Ben mentioned, if you can measure it, you're in a better position to manage it. But we can't track commitments and prioritise appropriately without a tracking framework, which is what's currently missing in the sector. Current cooling finance data sets are limited and they lack project level information, which prevents policymakers, development banks and commercial investors from assembling comprehensive cooling transaction databases. So really understanding the amount, geography, type of finance and distribution and absorption rate is going to be critical to prioritising new investments and to target those appropriately. So today's a first step towards that goal, and I'm really pleased that we're all part of the discussion in taking the next step. So this year, in collaboration with CPI and my colleagues in our Cooling for All program, we put together a framework for tracking cooling investments. The resulting knowledge brief, which I commend to you, proposes a new approach to identify and track these transactions, the first step towards understanding and acting on global growing needs for sustainable cooling solutions. So you're going to hear more from our cooling and finance experts on the panel. And ultimately, the objective of this work is to have the framework adopted and cooling finance commitments systematically tracked to prioritise new investment. So that's our scene setting for today, introducing both our cooling work and hopefully the energy finance work that we do at SEforALL to those of you who are not familiar with it. With that, it's my pleasure to now hand you over to Cooper Weatherby of CPI, who's been the lead author for this knowledge brief, and to follow with a discussion of the findings of the brief in detail, and then we'll turn to our panelists. So with that, Cooper, over to you.
Thanks for setting the stage, Olivia. Really useful context as we dive into our discussion today. So first, a little background on me. I'm an analyst at Climate Policy Initiative in San Francisco, where I split my time between tracking and analyzing trends in global climate finance and helping to develop innovative solutions for financial instrument issues through our incubator program, the Lab. I co-authored CPI's flagship Global Landscape of Climate Finance report in 2019, and more recently led development of a new methodology to measure Paris alignment in the power sector, which was published late last year in a series of 3 briefs entitled Paris Aligned. Turning our attention to today's webinar topic, I'm excited to present a look at the motivation and methods behind this Energizing Finance knowledge brief, as well as some next steps. We'll start with what we've quite dramatically labeled. Next slide, please. The problem. And by this we mean the current state of cooling finance tracking, and how we need to improve data sources related to cooling transactions. First of all, let's establish the importance of being able to access good data on cooling solutions investment. CPI has been doing climate finance tracking for quite some time now, and one of our big focuses is the biannual Global Landscape of Climate Finance report. Over the years of publishing the landscape, we've seen firsthand how understanding investment trends can help policymakers and market actors identify needs, gaps, and opportunities based on where and how capital is flowing to climate projects. Cooling is no exception to this. Global needs are growing rapidly, and comprehensive data on the state of play would be hugely helpful in multiple ways. Number one, to help us evaluate progress toward meeting those global needs, especially in high impact countries with the most urgent demand for cooling solutions. Secondly, to zoom in on how different strategies are being deployed. Are we seeing a lot of private finance or mostly investment from public sources? And how does that break out across sectors? This kind of detailed situational awareness is key. Next, cooling investment data would enable us to see just how quickly and fully we're shifting away from dirty, inefficient cooling toward cleaner, more efficient solutions. And finally, all of these items together can help nations create more detailed, actionable cooling action plans for the future. So, given how important it is to get these data, do we already have them? The answer to that, I'm afraid, is a resounding no. Most cooling investment data sets that we reviewed were lacking in at least one of two areas: granularity and comprehensiveness. Beginning in the top left quadrant of our chart, some sources, like the OECD's creditor reporting system, contain detailed transaction level data, but don't explicitly identify which transactions are cooling related or what types of cooling solutions are being deployed. Moving to the bottom right quadrant, National Cooling Action Plans, or NCAPs, provide a better breakdown of different types of cooling investments, but don't provide that information at transaction level. Instead, they're usually restricted to broad top-down estimates of investment totals. And then in the bottom left area here, you have some sources like equipment manufacturer datasets that are actually both too narrow and also too general in their coverage. So the worst of both worlds, really. So you can see what we're really lacking here is anything in this valuable top right quadrant, some kind of standardized system that could identify lots of kinds of cooling transactions and do this at the transaction level to enable the kind of deep analysis that we want to conduct on investment trends. That's where our first of its kind cooling investment tracking framework comes in. To be a little briefer, I'll refer to it as the framework for the rest of this presentation. So, now that we know about the problems with cooling investment data, how did we think about developing this framework to solve these problems? Let's take a look. Our review of these data sources that I just mentioned showed us that there were basically three key criteria we needed to satisfy. Our framework had to, first, provide clear guidance on how to categorize a wide range of cooling activities. By this, we mean not just the obvious things, like air conditioners and refrigerators, but also investments in policy development and some other areas to capture a wide range of cooling-related investment. We'll examine this further in just a bit. Second, we also had to make it painless to integrate with existing approaches. It's great to have a comprehensive standalone system, but realistically, implementing that system will be quite difficult if it doesn't fit into existing data management standards. And finally, we needed this framework to be flexible and adaptable as we continue to learn more and improve our understanding of cooling finance. With those three criteria in mind, here's how our new framework categorizes cooling transactions. We've identified four critical dimensions of cooling investment to be tracked at the transaction level in our framework. Number one, cooling orientation. So with this category, we're basically asking, is the transaction cooling related? And if so, to what extent? We've adopted some language from the OECD's climate finance classification system here. Specifically, we followed the OECD convention of categorizing an investment's cooling orientation as primary, significant, components, or none. Components meaning a minor portion of the transaction. There is some work to do here establishing the cutoffs for sorting into these 4 categories, and that's certainly something we're hoping to explore through a potential pilot project and eventually with a technical working group. Obviously, if we find in this category that a project is not at all cooling related, the other 3 dimensions are not material for our purposes, since the point of the framework is to provide specific insight into cooling investment. The second category, climate orientation. Is this investment clean? Is it efficient? I'll cover this in greater detail in the next slide, so stay tuned. Then the third category, solution type. This is where we ask, what are we talking about specifically when we say this transaction is a cooling investment? It could be a technology, like an air conditioner. It could also be a service, like a maintenance contract for cooling equipment. Then you have investments in policy, like funding for the development of minimum energy performance standards, or MEPS. And finally, financial support, which can come either in the form of tax breaks and budgetary support from government, or rebates from private sector firms like equipment manufacturers. Since it's common for real-life investments to actually span multiple solution types, our framework allows up to 3 selections in this category. And finally, we have purpose. When we say purpose, we really mean who benefits here. For example, if we look at an investment in a vaccine cold storage unit for a hospital, the purpose identified there is health. This approach allows us to use the existing CRS purpose codes that the OECD uses in its investment database. That kind of compatibility is key because it enables the type of integration I previously discussed as a must-have for our framework. Rather than standing apart from existing methods, this means the framework can be applied to evaluate the cooling dimensions of existing transactions in the OECD database, which should enable smooth implementation. In keeping with the OECD approach, only one purpose can be associated with a given transaction. So, unlike solution type, purpose is not a multiple choice category. Returning now to go a little deeper on the climate orientation category. Here is a helpful visual to explain how we're thinking about the climate impact of a given transaction. There are 2 important definitions to share here. So you see in the left circle, we've defined efficient investment as meeting local efficiency standards. On the right, we define clean investment as using less harmful refrigerants. The space in green in the middle, where they overlap, that's what we would call sustainable cooling, both clean and efficient. Making this distinction is important because it allows us to independently monitor progress toward both energy efficiency and clean refrigerant use, as well as the combined sustainability outcome that we're looking for. Now, I also want to be clear here that this Venn diagram applies strictly to active technology solutions like air conditioning and refrigeration. Other solution types, like policy or services, don't use energy or refrigerants at all. So our preliminary approach to defining the terms clean and efficient can't be applied to those types of investments. Again, how exactly to evaluate and apply these climate orientation labels to transaction records is something we're hoping to explore in a future technical working group. For now, though, the guidance you see here is very high level and conceptual and only applies to investment in technology solutions. So, with all of that said, here's a look at the overall code tagging system. You can see the possible entries for each of the categories, and as I mentioned, the solution type category allows for up to 3 different selections. I'll give you a second to look this over. And now we'll move on and look at how a sample transaction would be categorized. Here we have a hypothetical financing arrangement for construction of a school, including money for air conditioning units and heavy-duty insulation. Let's look at each of the 4 cooling dimensions for this example. So in the first category, the cooling orientation is components, which means cooling is a minor portion of the investment. Thinking about all the expenses that go into materials and labor for constructing a new school, the air conditioning units and insulation will probably be a fairly minor part of that total cost. So we'll select code C here. For climate orientation, since you'll see we don't have any indication of whether those AC units are MEPS compliant or what kind of refrigerants they use, we don't have a basis for determining whether this investment is clean, efficient, or both. We have to mark this Z for unknown. Next, for solution type, air conditioning units are an active technology and insulation is a passive technology. So we'll select A and B here. Since there's no third solution type to plug into the code, we would enter an X for none in the third code slot. And finally, since we're building a school here, the purpose is education, code B. That part is pretty straightforward. Put it all together and we get this 6-part code tag that can be applied to the transaction record. If we do this for every new investment added to your database, we can start to think about being able to analyze the global landscape of cooling finance. So, the future. Let's talk about what we need to do next to further develop and then implement this approach. The next steps from here, apart from all of you reading the full report available on the SEforALL website, of course, which I highly recommend, are as follows. Number one, we want to pilot the framework with a development finance institution and a data aggregator to get a read on whether this could really work and what changes we might need to make before doing a broader rollout. By implementing our approach at a limited scale on an existing transaction database, we could quickly identify and address any obvious oversights that could cause challenges, if and when the framework is rolled out more broadly. After the pilot, we would want to put together a technical working group to examine the nitty-gritty of how to categorize things in our 4 dimensions, with a special focus on the cooling and climate orientation items, since the criteria for those are not quite as well defined right now. Getting that nailed down would allow us to roll out the framework for large-scale adoption by financial institutions and data providers. And finally, what we'd like to achieve in the long run, we want to enable the collection and management of high-quality data to inform the kind of deep analysis of cooling investment that governments, Dfis, and private investors will need as they seek to meet complex and growing global demand for cooling solutions. That's all from me. So I'd like to thank the wonderful SEforALL team who made this report and webinar possible. Ben, Olivia, Brian, Christine, Stephen, Annette, and everyone else who had a hand in this, and also our panelists for today. And finally, I'd like to give a very special shout out to my colleague and friend, Chavi Mittal, who is not presenting today as she is out on maternity leave. Chavi, if you're listening in, congrats and best of luck for a safe delivery and a happy, healthy baby. And with that, I will pass it back to the SEforALL team.
We'll add a +1 for that from the SEforALL side as well. Thanks so much, Cooper. So we're now going to transition into a short panel discussion. I think there are some questions already popping up in the chat, and we'll try to address them as we go. And if we don't get a chance to address them, we'll try and do that in the Q&A as well. So just briefly again, I'll introduce our panelists one more time. First, we have Shilpa Patel, who's the head of the finance window at the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. Giorgio Gualberti, who's an analyst, climate and environmental development finance at the OECD, and Darren Bedrosian, who's an energy specialist with the World Bank's Smap section. So in a moment here, I'm going to take down the slides so we can have a bit more of an interactive conversation. So I'd encourage all our panelists, if they can, to put their videos on, or if not, be prepared to speak. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'll do this now. Thank you everyone for bearing with me. Okay, so we just heard the presentation from Cooper, and we'll bring him in at the end as well. But I think where I'd like to start today is with KSEP and with Shilpa, if that's all right. For those who may not know, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program has been a philanthropic catalyst for a great deal of finance beyond its endowment itself. But the scale of the challenge is likely even greater still, and greater certainly than than philanthropy can do addressed by itself. So I think from Shilpa, we're interested in knowing, what types of investment in KSEP's experience produce the most impactful results and the greatest leverage? And where would you advise governments and DFIs to invest today, given that we're a few years into this journey? So the floor is yours, Shilpa, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the SEforALL team for inviting me to speak here. So listen, financial investment, which is what I'll essentially be talking about, spans a wide spectrum, from VC type support for new technologies to impact investment, commercial finance, and really a wide range of players, from the public sector and governments to DFIs to the private investor. So our approach in KSEP was to really demonstrate the art of the possible and show that efficient climate-friendly cooling, the intersect that Cooper showed as sustainable, is profitable while also being good for the environment. And we wanted to demonstrate this across a wide range of delivery mechanisms and modalities, as well as geographies. And we worked with both private and public sectors, as well as DFIs, to do so. So how did we do this? We provided grant funding for project preparation support, audits, feasibility studies, and the like that push the envelope on cooling efficiency, activities that your typical financier will find hard to cover in the normal course of business. So let me give you 2 examples of this approach, and I think that might make it more real. KSEP provides support to Sustainable Development Capital, LLP, which is a private equity impact fund. Our funding allowed them to develop a strong pipeline of efficient, clean cooling investments in commercial buildings and hotels, mostly in Asia. Based on this experience, they are now raising a fund that will focus on cooling investment. The other is the World Bank, which you will hear from very shortly, which of course is a very large source of development finance. So their Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, or SMAP, is this donor-funded facility that allows the bank to provide technical assistance to developing countries as they design environmentally sustainable energy solutions. Our support seeded the Efficient Clean Cooling Program under SMAP, which has helped inform and influence the direction of the cooling components or elements of their lending. This is a great example, in my opinion, of philanthropy working with the DFI to advance a common agenda. And our grant making has been quite catalytic for the World Bank. What I've touched on really is how philanthropy can orient or reorient investment through a judicious use of philanthropic resources to incent or catalyze significant amounts of funding. Now, our grantees have only just begun on this journey, but even so, indications are that the activities KSEP funding made possible will inform over 600 million of climate-friendly, efficient cooling across the world. Pretty impactful mobilization. So just by way of closing, what I'd say our greatest success in phase 1 has been, obviously, again, from an investment standpoint and financial mobilization standpoint, was both in demonstrating the art of the possible and working to institutionalize cooling into IFIs. Now, as to where governments and DFIs should invest, all I can say is that there's so much to do and so many ways to do it that just paying more attention to this often neglected area is the first thing that governments and DFIs should do. They can enact and enforce better policies and regulations, institutionalize cooling in public banks and DFIs, and ensure that it gets integrated into major infrastructure, city planning, and agriculture and rural development. There's a lot more. For instance, we've heard from practically all our grantees that risk-sharing facilities would greatly enhance their capacity to push the envelope in terms of technologies. And that is also something that DFIs in particular could look into. I'll stop here and hopefully we can get more into some of this more in the discussion.
Yeah, of course. And I think one of the other things that I would add is, KSEP has had that focus on institutional strengthening in particular has set up a lot of organizations, including SEforALL, to really be able to be in this for the long term. And that's hard to quantify sometimes, and it takes a long time to pay back. So thanks very much, Shilpa. And yes, we'll try to come back to that in the discussion. I think I'm keen to hear about your thoughts on the risk sharing facilities in particular. So for now, I think I'd like to move to Giorgio Gilberti of the OECD. And Olivia mentioned it a little bit of this in her introduction as well. I think we'd be really interested in hearing about the process by which the OECD revised their energy access categories following the 2017 Energizing finance recommendations. And your insights into the discussion that enabled members to agree on the new categories. So maybe we can start with that and follow up as need be.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to SEforALL. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you. Regarding your question, the CRS codes are actually now they are being included as a UN standard, but they are decided within one of the subsidiary bodies of the DAC that is called WP-STAT, so the Working Party on Development Finance Statistics. This working party is a body where there are all the DAC members, but there are also observers, like for example the multilateral development banks, non-bilateral, other bilateral donors, where these kind of rules get decided. So the political rules, I mean the very big issues get decided at the DAC level, while more technical rules that sometimes are also political are decided in this subsidiary body. So this is as an introduction. So in 2017, I think there was this energizing finance research that was, there were several conclusions, but one of the conclusions was that the energy codes were not good enough to track some specificities of the support to energy access in developing countries, especially mini grids and clean cooking. So we revised them on these premises, and we went back to members. We also consulted with the SEforALL and other stakeholders. We went back to members, and then there was some kind of negotiation. Members made some edits and so on. At the end, we arrived to a final version that was published, and since last year, the data is collected with this new method. Is it, despite what was said before, it is possible to apply more than one purpose code with shares. This is something that you have to keep in mind. So the possibility to have a purpose code with cooling is always there. It's just that your framework seems so much more interesting to integrate actually than having just a simple purpose code. And the problem in general is that statistics are squared and the world is round. So I mean, we cannot make these taxonomies with so little boxes, because otherwise everything becomes too complex. But I mean, bringing up information, like you said, is like this framework is actually something that also influence action in a certain way, because I mean, if you don't have information on what's going on, you don't have action, you don't track what's going on, and so it's a way also of influencing things. So that's very interesting piece of work.
Thanks so much. And maybe if I can, while we're on it, I mean, it's super interesting, and I think we'd all be keen to learn a little bit more from the very sort of practical side of it. What do you see as being the next steps, Giorgio, for this cooling framework to make sure that it adds value to development finance institutions and data providers? Like, what do you see as the next steps, and how useful can this type of framework be for the OECD?
So, well, for the OECD, I mean, we as OECD, we give a service to the public that is setting up, helping members to set up the rules, collecting the data, processing it, and giving to to the public. So whatever we try to do is to give at the end information to the public. We have a new feature that we just implemented this year for the first time that start to track COVID-19 activities. That is a keyword field. A keyword field that we are discussing actually in 2 weeks. We are discussing the governance of this keyword field to include new keywords, so to track new areas of work. And this kind of framework would perfectly fit there. So this means that if the World Bank, just to say, or any other development finance institutions, any bilateral member wants to implement this kind of tracking framework for cooling investment, actually these informations, once created in the HQ of these financing institutions, can be transmitted to OECD, and OECD has now the technical capabilities of storing and communicating this data. Of course, what I'm saying is that the exact rules for implementing these additional voluntary keywords are not yet there. So we are going to discuss this in 2 weeks. There might be different opinions, but this is exactly an example that I will give actually in our meeting in a couple of weeks of how this new tool can be used as a plugin to include data that comes from other bodies, that is standards that are developed elsewhere, but they are still, I mean, in the public interest, they produce useful information for the public.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I'm sure your experience with on energy access in particular is very helpful with that as well. So speaking of the World Bank, I think I now like to turn to Darren. That's okay. As mentioned, the hope is in part that this is useful for institutions like the World Bank and for SMAP. And Shilpa elaborated a little bit on this in the beginning, but the World Bank has been looking at new investments in cooling that support climate change mitigation, adaptation, and the SDGs. Hoping that you can tell us if, in principle, a tracking framework is useful for your understanding of cooling investment and needs, and internally, within the bank, is a framework helpful for making the case for more investment or the use of different financial products for cooling? Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. And actually, I'll admit, as I was reading through the abstract and listening to Cooper's presentation today, when we first launched the Efficient Clean Cooling program at SMAP 2 years ago, thanks to the support of KSAP, as Shilpa explained, it's fair to say we really did envision this kind of tracking framework for our own portfolio at the time, albeit at a much higher level. So we've tried to take steps to guide ourselves in a same way, and we would certainly welcome collaboration. Let me briefly describe our mandate as SMAP as a trust fund within the World Bank, so it provides some context on how the tracking framework would be so relevant and how we could collaborate on it. Now, as most of you know, the World Bank provides billions in financing to developing countries each year, but the vast majority of this financing is not grants, it is primarily loans. So this is an important distinction because the countries that we support have many competing priorities and often limited bandwidth within their public sector to borrow and implement the funds into successful projects. So our principal mandate in SMAP is really centered around how can our grants influence the appropriate priorities, such as what we focus on in our program is access to cooling, for example, for households in tropical countries with unbearable temperatures and limited cooling options indoors, or proper refrigeration for vaccines in underserved health centers, or efficient cold storage facilities for dairy products for farmers. Those are some of the types of support we've come across and we've tried to prioritize. The technical assistance work funded by SMAP is very crucial in justifying these kinds of priorities to the governments that we work with. Now, the challenge in the absence of a established tracking framework like we are proposing today, is making that justification, how to demonstrate that focusing on cooling and deploying significant financing for cooling investments in terms of actual projects implemented by the countries we support makes sense and contributes to achieving the development goals we focus on. In our case, eliminating poverty and boosting shared prosperity, and in turn addressing climate change, which can be done concurrently, as Shilpa and Cooper both pointed out. Now, internally, we certainly do keep track of our own financial commitments, and in a similar categorization and breakdown to the abstract I read through and that Cooper outlined, just with different internal jargon, as you can imagine, but we'd certainly welcome harmonizing. Our main concern is how much leverage our grants have on the sectors, or in the term of the framework of the purposes that Cooper explained, that our technical assistance activities cover. How can we ensure that the hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money is effectively committed to generate hundreds of millions or even billions in investment in the right priorities in cooling in the countries we want to target who need it the most? So for example, as Shilpa mentioned, with our efficient clean cooling program, an initial budget of $3 million in grants has now led to over 600 million in financing across World Bank project components focused on cooling. So we track these grants and subsequent project investments by country, region, sector, financial modality, or as it's referred to in the abstract of the tracking framework, financial solution type. And we would certainly welcome harmonizing this tracking. For example, so far we know that over 60% of our cooling grants have been for the purpose of cold chains in the agriculture sector. We can also estimate that about a third of the project financing that our grants have informed have cooling at least as a significant orientation, while more than half of these projects have cooling as just a component of the financing, such as the new school construction example that Cooper described. I thought that was a very good example of the challenges in tracking these distinctions. But rarely is cooling the sole principal orientation in a project. Actually, so far, I can only think of one case, which was actually a passive cooling case. We also know that about half of our program's total financing across World Bank projects involves solution types for financial intermediaries. That's the term we use, where the World Bank financing is on lent to local markets in the countries that we cover to spur investments in cooling, either through local banks or local financial institutions. What would be even more beneficial to know, with big thanks to this tracking framework, if we can work together on it, is the breakdown of financial flows outside of our own financing. What are the investments from governments, the private sector, civil society organizations, or other donors and Dfis, to which solution types, for what purpose, and in which sector? And we would certainly welcome contributing to this tracking, because we not only keep track in a similar logic, but being able to compare the direction of our own funds with the rest of the stakeholders we work with in the cooling space would be invaluable to step back and evaluate our own strategies and see if we are addressing the crucial needs, and if we need to reorient on a regular basis. So we would certainly welcome collaboration on this tracking framework, and I'll pause here, and I look forward to hearing the next steps for the technical working group and other initiatives.
Thanks so much, Darren. Really appreciate it. And it's helpful to have such a good sort of analytical perspective from what we hope will be one of the big users of this. And yes, looking forward to next steps. I think I wanted to have a very quick follow-up for all of our panelists before we jump into a Q&A, excuse me. So maybe in a sentence or two, I'm interested to know what you think the biggest challenge will be in implementing a cooling investment tracking framework from a practical perspective. And for that working group, and for those next steps, what would be your suggestions to make sure that we actually sort of get this implemented? And maybe I'll go to Shilpa first.
Okay, well, I think the speakers have alluded to this, and Cooper certainly pointed this out as well. I think the biggest challenge is that most investors do not think of cooling as a separate investment category. It's generally one component of a larger, of a broader investment package. It could be it's part of an infrastructure investment or part of an investment into a company or an agricultural project. That's cool, as we saw. So investors don't ring fence parts of their investment for tracking purposes generally. So I think this is going to be a big challenge. And I think that Cooper can certainly speak to this much better than I can, but even tracking just broad climate finance comes with so many challenges that trying to sort of become more granular, just, I think that the challenges just keep growing. So, which is not to say that we shouldn't attempt to track, because I think that is important for us to know. And as you rightly said, what gets measured tends to get managed. But I don't want to rain on this parade. So please, and I'm just sort of throwing this out in just in a very frank manner, but I don't think we should get overly hung up on defining the best tracking methodology per se at this stage. I mean, from a purely practical standpoint, and looking at it as KSEP, for example, is, there may be more mileage in pushing policy measures that ensure that investors are investing in the right kinds of cooling investment, ensuring that investors avoid high GWP refrigerants, that they blacklist appliances that don't meet certain energy performance standards. I think we can work on refining a tracking methodology alongside, but I would really urge that perfection not become the enemy of the good.
That's super helpful, and I think it's something we're very aware of. And I think it maybe we can turn to Giorgio next, because I think you had some experience, and there are some lessons that we can learn from energy access with this. And certainly, the energy access tracking framework works alongside a number of processes that a number of or sort of an evolving way of thinking about energy access finance. So maybe quickly, Giorgio, you can give us a bit of insight as to the practical next steps that the iteration of this type of framework can take alongside that urgent sort of pace of investment that Shilpa cited.
Well, thank you. I also agree with what Shilpa just said. I think that the point that we always see with not only with members but also with multilateral institutions and other data providers that give the data that submit the data to us to then publish it, is that there is a certain fatigue. I mean, when there is too much complexity, members and reporters have struggled sometimes with producing the data. That said, the data is very important, and today we have much more advanced IT tools and management tools that can, in a certain way, produce the data also a little bit more automatically. And this data can be then shared with the public. So on the implementation side, I mean, on our side at OECD level, as I said, we have now the possibility to implement these kind of frameworks. Of course, members will need to agree, which will need to be discussed, of course. But the important thing is how this kind of things take up. I mean, if members are really willing to use them, then we can push it down the road. but the data is produced by the World Bank, by France, by UK, by all these, also by philanthropic institutions that produce the us. So if these institutions pick up this kind of frameworks or any other frameworks, even simplified, then we are able to push it down the road and get it out and store this data and publish and make it available for the public. But my experience is that this implementation tool is effectively very, very delicate. So it's important to have champions. That's it. I mean, if you have a big institutions that thinks, or a coalition of institutions that not only thinks that the tracking framework is useful per se to produce information, but because through this, it's able to influence actions in the field, because that's at the end is the things that it's important. It's important to have cooling systems that are sustainable. It's important that you have chemicals that are the right one and not the ones that have a very high global greenhouse warming potential, sorry, and so on. So I mean, this is important if it's able to show the road and at the end improve what's happening in the field.
Great. Thanks very much. Yeah, so maybe we can go to Darren for his reaction as well, and then I'll come to Cooper with a few questions from the chat.
Thanks, Ben. And actually, my immediate reaction when I saw that biggest challenge question was I was going to talk about consistency and harmonization, but I think Shilpa said it quite well, where let's not make perfect be the enemy of the good, because at the end of the day, we want to ensure the financing and the investment in cooling is increasing regardless of how we categorize it, and we want to, or how we clarify the orientation or the category, but we want to make sure the right priorities are addressed. So my immediate reaction was, how do we constitute investments as a significant orientation or a principal orientation or just a minor component? Because we face that struggle quite a bit in our own internal analysis and our own internal accounting. But having a harmonized approach with champions, as Giorgio mentioned, would really add a lot of value. And another thing I want to point out, I saw a great question in the chat about can't there be more than one category associated? Even in the school example that Cooper pointed out, there are some passive elements and some active elements. So making it flexible enough and not allowing the perfect be the enemy of the good, as Shilpa rightly said.
No, that's great. Thank you very much to our panelists. I think we have a few questions in the chat. I think, and we have about 5 minutes left. So I think what I'll do is I'll send it over to Cooper, the lead author, to address a few of them. And then we'll wrap up. We will take note of the questions and try to address them subsequently in an FAQ or a QA that we'll send around to the participants. So maybe with that, I think there are three sort of questions that I wanted to direct to Cooper, and feel free to react to any of the other ones as well. Could you explain a little bit more about why multiple purposes can't be assigned per transaction? Another question is, can you highlight how pilot projects and R&D investments that are taking place in the private sector, as well as those that focus on non-refrigerant-based solutions, can be included in this framework? And then finally, there was a question about the OECD membership and India and China's participation and any challenges that you might foresee as a result of that in the future. So maybe with that, over to you, Cooper.
Sure, thanks, Ben. And I'll actually take those back to front, because on the first one, I would like to throw it over to Giorgio after I say my piece. I think his perspective could be really useful there. So on the point about OECD membership precluding India and China and potential challenges that could arise from that, I assume, with standardizing the format in which investments are recorded, that's a great question. That's something that we at CPI have dealt with in the past on our global landscape of climate finance. And so we've worked directly with Indian and Chinese development banks to basically process their data in a way that gives us outputs that are consistent with what the OECD uses. That's not to say it's easy. It certainly can be time consuming, but it's also an experience that's informed the way that we've developed this framework, which is that basically, you know, we feel pretty confident that we'd be able to process similar cooling data sets from India and China in a way that would be compatible with the framework as we've constituted it here, overlaying on OECD purpose codes. The point on pilot project R&D investments, can this be included in the tracker? Theoretically, it could, because I see here this commenter has specified the private sector. I'll just say that for now, we're really focused on public finance, on development finance and government spending. And so because of that, it might be slightly out of scope to start thinking about how we're categorizing private sector transactions at the moment. But certainly we've designed the framework in such a way that we're hoping it could be expanded to the private sector in the future once we sort of work out some of the kinks in how those categories are assigned. And then lastly, so the question about, could you explain a little bit more about why multiple purposes can't be assigned per transaction? That was actually an observation of mine going through the OECD database, that in the data I saw, I didn't see multiple purposes assigned in a given transaction. But Giorgio just shared that it actually is possible to assign multiple ones. And so I'd love to pass it on to him to kind of talk about that, because that wasn't my previous understanding, but I'm glad I showed up for the webinar today because I learned something new. I think if we can reach a place where it makes sense for us to select multiple purposes there and know that we're still in compliance with the way OECD tracks their data, then we could absolutely do that in the framework.
Maybe we can turn it back to Giorgio for
okay.
a quick response.
Yeah, so very quickly on this, yes, we can have multiple purpose codes with a share. So we can say that 80% of an activity goes to, I don't know, renewable energy generation, and another 20% goes to water, just to say. And then you didn't see, because then we split the activity. So we duplicate the activities, and then we have two activities that have the same information, but two different purpose codes. And of course, the amount is, there is only a share of the original amount. So that's why you don't see it. And this is the point. There is one thing I want to say. I think that this information is mainly on cross-border flows. And so, I mean, OECD DAC does have some south-south cross-border flows. We are developing, an international task force is developing a new statistical framework that is called TOSD, Total Official Support for Sustainable Development. This will be launched in a few weeks at tosd.org. And this is a framework in which is not only, in which the rules are not set by DAC members, but there is an international task force that has both multilateral institutions, some DAC members, some countries like Brazil, like South Africa, China is an observer. And so this kind of framework can be useful to have, and we could eventually integrate this kind of cooling tracking also there, because we have, of course, compatible fields, so not to duplicate the work of anyone. There is one thing on this, that this can also track support to global public goods that is not tracked by DAC statistics.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for that. I think it's nice to know sort of what your next steps should be as you come out with a knowledge piece, and it's nice to know that there's some practical routes and some good advice on not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. So we are at time. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's still on the line with us for sticking through it and listening to the whole thing. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And we will follow up as discussed. We also want to thank our funders, of course, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And if you're interested, the full list of SEforALL funders are on our website at the link you can see below. And we're very happy to have done this in collaboration with the Cool Coalition. And if you're interested in the topic, there will be a series of cooling-related webinars over the course of the spring with SEforALL, and through our This Is Cool communications campaign, which I'd encourage you to check out. at thisiscool.seforall.org. So with that, I'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you, Giorgio, Cooper, Shilpa, Daron, Olivia, and all who participated. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you have a good rest of your day wherever you are.